contributing to this. Titain lecha. So he says, Nira habiur sheba Torah lamdena bezeki kodem shashofet shofet esam alav kodem kol yoshofet la'atzm ba'oso davar. A very similar thought, a very similar idea, that before the judge judges others, they should judge themselves. Chazal tells the Gemara, Bab Metzia Kov Zayin teaches, Kishot atzmacha ve'achar kach kishot achirim. First judge, first evaluate yourself, and then evaluate others. Zeh ma shenemar kan, kodem kol shoftim v'shotrim titein lecha, sheyishpetu es atzmam. Judge ourselves. When you know that you're clean, when you know that you're pure, when you know that you're innocent, then you can judge others. And then it will be a mishpat tzedek. Shoftim v'shotrim titain where? Lecha. And then v'shoftu asam mishpat tzedek. First judge yourself. Kishot atzmacha v'achar kach kishot achirim. You know, when you point a finger at others, you have three fingers pointing back at yourself. That which we see as a blemish in others, kol haposel b'mumo posel. When we're willing to dismiss, when we're willing to judge, when we're willing to assume about others, we're really revealing a lot about ourselves. So this pasuk, while it's giving us, of course, a national mission or mandate about our attitude and approach towards others, it also very, very much is teaching us about our responsibility towards ourselves. That you should not be in a position that you are judging others, but before first correcting. The Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch says that word kishot, which means Chazal here interpreted to mean kishot atzmacha v'achar kach kishot achirim, means first judge, first fix, first correct or repair yourself, and then others. So Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch points us to Be'an Arachitz, points us to Bruch Shmei. In Bruch Shmei we say Araisa kishot and V'yoi kishot, Kodesh Baruch Hu's kishot. Kishot means truth, genuine, authentic, real. Kishot atzmacha, be truthful with yourself, be honest with yourself, and then achar kach kishot achirim. We shouldn't tell ourselves lies. We shouldn't distort our view of ourselves. We shouldn't rationalize. The word rationalize is we tell ourselves rational lies. We should be honest with ourselves, kshot, honest with ourselves, and then kshot achirim. So all that is included. Shoftim v'shotrim titein lecha b'chol sha'arecha lecha. First judge yourself. First look at yourself, and only then v'shavtu asam can you look at those around you, and then it will be mishpat tzedek. Then it will be just and honest because you're not holding to a double or dual standard. We are first holding and evaluating ourselves. Rav Druk notes another anomaly in this very pasuk. Shoftim v'shotrim titein lecha b'chol sha'arecha. Hapasuk mascha shoftim v'shotrim lashon yachid. It begins with specifically a lashon yachid. It begins in the singular. U'mesayim v'shaftu esa'am. Shaftu is lashon rabim, is plural. So which is it? Is it the individual, the singular lashon yachid, shoftim titein lecha, or is it v'shaftu in the lashon rabim in the plural? And he says the following. We already explained based on the Chidah and the Shla. He says we're talking about the individual. You have to place a guard and an officer at every entrance to your body, to your soul. You have to be judicious and vigilant in how we live and how we behave. What does it mean v'shaftu asam mishpat tzedek? And he therefore suggests the following. Nira leva'ir api yisod sheyastu rabbeinu. Kasher adam mischazik b'liman haTorah shmir mitzvos ein ze inyan shelo bilvad ela mashpiyahu b'zeh al kol ha'olam kulo. You see, when we improve ourselves, when we elevate ourselves, when we are more careful ourselves, and we behave in a better way ourselves, we don't only improve ourselves, it trickles down, it overflows, it has an impact and it lifts all those around us. The opposite is also true. If a person slips or slides, if a person is more lackadaisical or casual in their attitude towards Torah and mitzvos, if their fire is dimmed or extinguished, if the person is much more relaxed, then the people around them are going to become uninspired as well. We are a product of our environment. The Rambam says you have to choose so carefully where you live, because socially our friends and our neighborhood, our neighbors and our environment, both nature and nurture, have an enormous impact on us, and we have that enormous impact on it. And that's what the pasuk is coming to tell us. He suggests that why does it switch? Why does it transition from the singular to the plural? That shoftim v'shotrim titein lecha individually, and then v'shaftu esa'am in the plural collectively, to teach us that the decisions and the attitude that we have for ourselves doesn't only impact ourselves, but will impact those around us. It's true in a virus, it's true in wearing masks, it's true in distancing and behavior, and it's true metaphysically, it's true spiritually, it's true the spiritual viruses that can contaminate and that can be transmitted as well. our attitude, our approach, our vigilance is not just about us. It's not an individual sport. It's a team sport. It's a team world. And the attitude that we bring will have a much more global impact. And that's what the Parsha is beginning by telling us, that the judgment that we have, and the judgment that we use, what's safe, what's correct, what's moral, what's ethical, what's appropriate, the Shoftim v'Shotrim, the judgment that we use, and the vigilance, the officers that we place around our behavior and our attitude, it begins with Lecha, what we choose for ourselves, ends with V'Shaftu in the plural, will impact the greater number, will impact the greater amount, and therefore we have to be very careful in our choosing how we're going to behave, and being very, very careful and clear in how we use our judgment. The pasuk then addressing now the judges. V'losata mishpat l'sakir panim. A judge has to not pervert judgment. You're not allowed to respect someone's presence. V'lo sikach shochad. Don't accept bribes. Why? Ki hashochad ya'aver einei chachamim v'salef divrei tzadikim. Bribery is pernicious. Bribery is odious. Bribery corrupts. Bribery compromises justice. Lo sikach shochad. Don't accept shochad. And why should you not accept shochad? Well, the pasuk Ketef tells us why. Chazon Ish holds it's a chok. Chazon Ish writes in Emunah and Bitachon that shochad, that accepting bribery, is not really a rational law, but it's a chok. And how does he know it? Because he says the shochet, who has a lot of money invested in the shchita, whether the animal is kosher or not kosher, the shochet is believed regarding his own shchita. A person is believed regarding their own kashrus. A rav can paskin regarding his wife's own need, the shilas. So you see that even though one is, so to say, has a bias, nevertheless, they're allowed to judge in those cases. Shochad, he concludes, is a chok. But most disagree. And they say it's not true. Shochad, bribery, is a very rational rule. And the pasuk itself here tells us the reason why. Ye'aver einei chachamim. It blinds, it clouds the eyesight, the judgment, the vision of whom? Of the chachamim. It's a very powerful pasuk. It means who is prone to bribery? Who is vulnerable or susceptible to having their opinions swayed by a bribe? Not just the wicked or the evil or the corrupt. It says, Ya'aver einei chachamim v'salef divrei tzadikim. It blinds the eyes of the wise, and v'salef, it makes crooked, whom? The divrei tzadikim. So you see that bribery is something that can affect, that can compromise not only those who are corrupt, but even those who are wise and those who are righteous. That's how powerful, that's how impactful, that's how penetrative it is. We gave 3 or 4 shiurim about shochad and protects earlier this year. You could listen on my website, Rabbi from Goldberg.org, or on YU Torah. We applied it to modern applications of questions. The bribery scandal that happened in the world earlier this year. You remember that? There was in our lives, we're divided between pre-corona and after corona. So you may remember pre-corona, there was a whole scandal of those college admission bribery scandals. But those scandals and that protects you happens all the time, not only in college, secular college campuses. It happens in yeshivas and chadarim and kolim. Who do you know, and how much did your grandfather donate, and what's your connection, and how do you get in? And we gave a series of shiurim approaching this question. But that's how shochad, it has that impact on the on chachamim and tzadikim. The pasuk earlier in Shmos on Perach Gimel, shochad lo sikach ki shochad yaver pikchim v'salef divrei tzadikim. There the pasuk doesn't say it clouds the judgment of the wise. It says pikchim, those who are clear-sighted, those who are bright. It's not just that if you're stupid you accept a bribe. People who are brilliant accept a bribe. That's the power, that's the temptation of bribery. It appears no less than 3 times in the Torah. It appears once in Tehillim. Tehillim Tezvav, one of my favorite prakim of all Tehillim, a very short parak that talks about what is the description, what are the criteria of a righteous person. Kaspo lo nosan beneshach, it's a person who doesn't lend with interest. V'shochad al naki lo lakach, and a person who never accepts bribery against the innocent. Osa elo leolam, a person who behaves in that way will never be shaken, will never be abandoned forever. That is the righteous lifestyle that a person should aspire to. David HaMelech describes, and in the behaviors or character traits of the truly righteous, David HaMelech includes shochad al naki lo lakach. That is our parsha, the prohibition of accepting shochad. The Gemara Ksubas teaches us about this pasuk, about this prohibition of shochad, that it doesn't just mean if you change your mind. It's not just bribery is prohibited if it actually sways your opinion. Even if you stay with your opinion, you're forbidden to accept a bribe. So you're going to accept that student anyway. You're going to rule in the favor of that particular litigant anyway. Nevertheless, it's prohibited to take a bribe. Why should that be? Why should that be? So the Sfas Emes writes, Losika Shochad on our Parsha, Hatam ki ha-mishpat le'Elokimhu, because Baruch Hu nasan lanu koach ha-mishpatim shebetorah. When we are analyzing, when we are adjudicating, when we are trying to conclude what is true, what is just, what is right, what is righteous, it shouldn't come from our boich, it shouldn't come from our intuition or our instinct. It has to come from the pursuit of trying to reveal the will of Hashem, the Ratzon Hashem, because that's the only true truth. That is the only authentic. And that's what Sfas Emes explains. The Gemara uses the language of Lashon, Hadan din emes la'amito. A dayan, a justice, a judge, who has done emes la'amito, who is trying to discover or pursue or rule the truth in the truth. It's a very clumsy or awkward expression. What does it mean to be done din emes la'amito? How do you rule the truth in the truth? And that's what the Sfas Emes suggests. He says, you could come to the truth by accident. A broken clock is right twice a day. You could come upon the truth. You could stumble upon it by accident. You could also come to it for the wrong reasons and the wrong conclusions. You can come to the conclusion that is true, not out of emes, but out of sheker. You were bribed. You happened to judge in favor of what's right, but you were bribed to do it. That's what the Torah is telling us. Shochad lo, don't accept bribery, even if it doesn't sway your opinion, even if you rule what's correct. Why? Because our mission is to be done din emes la'amito. Not only to come to the right conclusion, but to come to it for the right reason. The right conclusion for the right reason. Because that's how we draw close, that's how we connect, that's how we stick to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's how we reveal His goal, His vision for this world. Only when you seek the truth, with the power of the Torah that's true, can you really cling to the source of truth. But when a person is willing to hear bribery, show favor, be swayed, afilu tzedek, even if you're correct, then it's not truth. It's not din emes la'amito. Sfas Emes on our Parsha, Parshas Shoftim. Not only are you prohibited from offering a bribe, the Rambam in Hilchos Sanhedrin, Parachav Gimel, says that the judge is forbidden from taking the bribe. Why? Because of lo lifnei iver lo sitein mechshol, a prohibition of lifnei iver. You're not allowed to accept a bribe. Okay. Torah then continues pasuk chaf. Tzedek tzedek tirdof. You have to pursue tzedek. Now, did the Torah all of a sudden develop a stutter? Why is the Torah being redundant? Tzedek tirdof. What is added by the double language of tzedek? Righteousness shall you pursue. Tzedek tirdof. My brother-in-law's father is a federal judge in New York, and in his chamber he has these words, tzedek tirdof, written. This is what he has, the Torah. He is prescribing his attitude towards justice. Why the double language? Tzedek tirdof. Why not just tzedek? So Rav Simcha Bunim of Pshischa says, tzedek tirdof. Shegames ha-tzedek tirdof. Yesh lasos ba'ofen shel tzedek. B'drachim ru'uyos v'no shekein k'dei lahasig matar kedosha tzarech l'shtamish b'emsam kedoshim. V'lo ka'osam harot from tzedek u'v'darchim romsim es hakol. Simcha Bunim has a penetrating insight, and such an important insight in our time and for all times. He says the dual language tzedek tirdof means tzedek b'tzedek tirdof. Pursue righteousness with righteousness. You see sometimes people have a righteous ends and they pursue it with a very unrighteous means. So they have a very righteous, noble ends. They're trying to fight for justice, fight for the vulnerable, fight for the downtrodden, fight for the targeted, fight for the discriminated against. But they do so in such an unjust way. Look at some of the movement we're seeing in our time, standing up to oppose racism. That's wonderful. All good people should participate in a movement that opposes racism. But rioting, looting, discriminating against others, that's not tzedek b'tzedek tirdof. That's an extreme example. There are much less extreme examples in shul politics, in life, in the workplace. Tzedek, people have a noble and just cause that they're fighting for, but they fight for it in very ignoble and unrighteous ways. And that's what the pasuk is telling us as Rav Simcha Bunim. Tzedek b'tzedek tirdof. Pursue justice with justice. But the Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Lamed Beis has a different interpretation of tzedek. The Gemara there says tzedek tirdof, echad l'din ve'echad l'pshara. The reason it's repeated twice is to tell us that there is not only one kind of justice, there are two kinds of justices. That doesn't sound very just. That sounds corrupt. What do you mean there are two kinds of justices? How could that be? So the Gemara says There's a tzedek of din, and there's a tzedek of pshara. There's a tzedek of the absolute rule. What is the absolute correct thing to do? Absolute justice, objective justice. But there's also a tzedek, there's a righteousness to pshara. Pshara means compromise, the spirit of compromise. Compromise, by definition, is not staying true to what is just. When you reach a compromise, you're not following the strict letter of the law. You're actually compromising. Whenever I mediate, whether it's two partners in a fight or marriage or whatever scenario, I always introduce the mediation by saying that we're looking to create a compromise, and the definition of a compromise is something neither party is happy about, but both parties can live with. The spirit of a compromise is something you're not necessarily happy about, but you could live with. If you were happy with it, then you would have gotten your way. Maybe that's just, but it's not a compromise. A compromise is something that neither party is necessarily happy about, but both can live with. That's not unjust. A compromise is also a form of justice. Tzedek tzedek tirdof, echad l'din ve'echad l'pshara. Sometimes there's din, sometimes there's something that's absolutely correct, and sometimes there is the spirit of a compromise, and a compromise is also a form of something which is correct. The Gemara wonders, Ketzad, and the Gemara gives an example. Two boats are passing in the river, and they encounter one another. Who gets to go first? What are the ethics of lines? That's what we did in this series, 3 or 4 or 5 parts, I forgot how many, about the laws of bribery, of protectia, of lines. What are the ethics of lines? We went through a number of shilas. But what are the ethics? What are the halachas that guide the formation of a line? Who gets to go first? Can anyone cut the line? Can the vulnerable, the weak, the disabled, the poor, can a Talmud Chacham cut the line? Is anyone entitled to use protectia to get in earlier, to cut the line? We saw that in questions of supermarkets. We saw that in the case of organ donor or organ recipient lines. We saw that from the small to the large. Can you use protectia to cut a line? What are the ethics and what are the halachas of it? I encourage you, if you're interested, to listen. We addressed some fascinating shilas. Hashuke Chemer of Zilberstein had a fascinating question. He was asked, apparently, there was an Einfall. Somebody had a great idea. They walk into a supermarket, and there's always long lines to check out, so they had a great idea. They put the cart online at the checkout, empty, and then they walk around and start shopping, and as they collect their goods, they put it in the cart that's already moving on the line, and by the time they're done getting their things and have filled their cart is at the front of the line. Is that correct? Is it correct? Morally, ethically, halachically, is it correct? Is it permissible? That and other fascinating questions like it. Torah then goes on and tells us, you're not allowed to plant an idolatrous tree, an asherah, a tree that's bowed down to, a form of idolatry. You can't plant it where? Near the Mizbeach. What's the connection between an idolatrous tree and judges and justice? We spoke about that in previous Parsha classes. It is a fascinating question. You're not allowed to offer an animal with a mum. It's a form of a to'eva. It is a form of a abomination to Hashem. We have the death penalty for one who worships idols, and so on. Okay, Perak Yud Zayin Pasuk Ches, page 1026 in the Art Scroll Stone Chumash. Ki yipalei mimcha davar l'mishpat bein dam l'din bein din l'din bein nega l'nega divrei rivos b'sha'arecha v'kamta v'alisa l'makom asher yivchar Hashem l'kecha bo. If a matter of judgment is hidden from you, what happens? You live where you live and you have shilas, you have questions. You're not sure exactly how to observe properly the halacha. What do you do? There are debates. There's more than one opinion. Ki palei mimcha. The word palei means it's a pella. It's a pella. Rashi says ki palei kol hafla lashon havdala uprisha sha'adala nivdal u'mechusa mimcha. A pella, a wonder, means that it's something which is obscured from you, something which is covered from you. You don't have access to it. You are distanced from it. It's nivdal u'mechusa, and you don't know what the halacha is. What's this mean? Bein dam ladin is bein dam tam ladam tar. Questions in nida. Bein din ladin is bedin zaka ladin chayev. Are questions in civil law. You don't know who is right and who's wrong, who's obligated, who's exempt. Bein nega lenega. When it comes to laws of tsaras, divrei rivos. When it comes to fights, what do? You get up and you go to the place, i.e., you go to the place that I've chosen. Again, a throwback to last week's Parsha. We talked about last week's Parsha. Why doesn't Hashem give us the coordinates? He never tells us where it is. Where is this Beis HaMikdash? Where is this mysterious Makom Asher Yibchar Hashem Elokecha Bo? We talked about last week, the Ramban, Rabbi Soloveitchik, that we're supposed to magnetically be drawn to it, intuit it. We're supposed to want to, on our own, search and discover holiness and find it. So when you have these questions, you're supposed to go specifically to this place, and Uvas al HaKohanim, you'll come to the Kohanim, the Leviim, Hashofet Asher Ba Mehem, V'darash V'agid Locha, you'll ask them, and they will tell you, Apia Torah Asher Yerucha. This is the source of rabbinic law, rabbinic authority. The Torah here is telling us exactly. Hashem says, I gave you a Torah, I gave you a written Torah. But you also have rabbis, and they are the ambassadors. They are transmitting the oral Torah. And when a question rises, Lo sasur min hadivar asher yagidu locha yamin ismol. Do not stray from what they tell you, right or left. Lo sasur is the power of rabbinic law. So why do I have to keep Chanukah and Purim? And why is it that I can't go swimming on Shabbos, or I have to observe other forms of rabbinic laws in my life? Why do I have to keep all these rabbinic laws? So the Torah says, Lo sasur. Observing rabbinic law is a biblical law. The Rambam and the Ramban have a famous discussion. If that's the case, why do we say Savik Dorais L'choma Savik D'Rabbanan L'Kula? That a doubt in a biblical law we're strict, a doubt in a rabbinic law we're lenient. Every rabbinic law really is a biblical law. So really, every doubt in a rabbinic law is a doubt of a biblical law. It's a great discussion between the Rambam and the Ramban, not for now. But Lo Sasur, observing rabbinic law, has an element of observing a biblical law, because the Torah empowers and charges the rabbis to be the ones who interpret and to be the ones who institute laws that are safeguards for us, and laws that are new laws for us to observe. The Shloah Kadosh, the Shnei Luchos HaBris, or Yeshaya Horowitz, has another beautiful understanding and interpretation, homiletically, of what this pasuk means. And he says the following. Listen carefully. We're still in Chodesh Av. Elul has not yet begun. We're still in the month in which we mourned the destruction, the devastation, the distance from the Shekhinah and the causes of it. And he says the following. Shloah Kadosh says this pasuk is describing Medaber be'inyan ha'churban. Ki yipalei mimcha. If you wonder, you're sick and tired. Yispala adam ha'mishpato shel Kadosh Baruch Hu bein dam l'dam. And you want to understand HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I don't understand bein dam l'dam. Dam chayav ha'of ha'torah mitzav l'chaso. So when it comes to the blood of an animal, the Torah says after you shech the animal, you have to cover the blood. V'dam Yisrael nishpach kamayim v'lahu b'lekvura. And yet Jewish blood flows freely, and so many of our ancestors weren't even given the privilege of a proper burial. Bein din l'din. When it comes to animals, the Torah says, you're not allowed to shecht an animal at its child on the same day. It's cruel. Ve'ilu am Yisrael, banav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, nishchatim banam halavas v'yaladim rakem b'chek imosam. And here we have mothers and their children, families who were slaughtered simultaneously. Bein nega l'nega. I don't understand. The guy, Torah Omer Slotis Kol HaKelim and Amayis Lefi Shoris V'Nos Notzo. Ilu Beis HaMikdash Makam Hashras Hashchim Ba'olam Nisra V'Nechrav Kula Kol Kelev. When it comes to a house that is afflicted with tzaras, we take out all of its contents in order to save and preserve them. And yet your holy Beis HaMikdash, it was burned to the ground with everything in it. Ki yipalei mimcha davar, says the Shloah Kadosh, the pasuk means, Ki yipalei, you've reached a point of wonder. You don't accept, how can it be, Hashem? Why do you have such a dual standard? Bein dam l'dam. The way you ask us to treat the blood of animals between the way our blood is treated. Bein din l'din. The laws that pertain to not showing cruelty to the animal, and look how much cruelty has been shown to the Jew. Bein nega l'nega, between our possessions. All this. How could God not be more careful, more protective of His honor and our honor? And the answer is, says the Shloah Kadosh, keep reading in the pasuk. You know what the answer is if you wonder? You know what the answer is if you don't understand? Divrei rivos b'sha'arecha. It's because of the divrei rivos, because of the machlokas, because of the infighting, because of the baseless hatred, the senas chinam, because of the way you treat one another. If you want to know why there is this duplicitousness, why there's this dual standard, why the world treats us differently than the way we're supposed to behave, bein din l'din, dam l'dam, nega l'nega, divrei rivos b'sha'arecha. The answer is because of our infighting, because of the way we treat one another, because of our attitude, because of our baseless hatred. When we don't treat one another correctly, then the world has no problem mistreating us as well. Says La Shloah Kadosh, maybe homiletically, that's what this pasuk is alluding to. That's what this pasuk is hinting at. Okay, so after we've seen the Torah institution, the authority of rabbinic law, that the rabbis are empowered to be the ambassadors, the interpreters, and also the authors of law, we move over to another law, namely the law of the king. Kisavo al ha'arta shashan lakacha nosen lach v'yirishta v'yishavte ba v'yamarta asima alay melach kechol hagoyim asher sevivosai. You're going to enter the land. There are three laws. The Rambam writes, when you enter the land of Israel, there are three laws that dictate our behavior. We have to conquer the land, eliminate the Amalek and the Canaanite nations. We have to establish a king, and then we build the Beis HaMikdash. Does the modern government of Israel have the status of a king? Interesting question in halacha. The laws that apply to a king, the king is the sovereign of Israel. Does the modern elected government of Israel have the halachic status of a king with implications? Interesting discussion in halacha. What are they empowered or entitled to do? So when we enter the land, we have to follow this threefold formula and do these three things. And the Torah here describes it as v'yamarta, you will say, asima alecha melach. You will want that king. Mikerev achecha tasim alecha melach. The king has to arise from among you. You can't have a king. A king cannot be from a convert or from those who did not originate. Lo sucha lasas alecha ish nachri ashelo achichahu. The Sifri says here, melach v'lo malka. It's a king, not a queen, from which the Rambam deduces that positions of authority are prescribed specifically for men, not for women. Not because women are not trustworthy, not because women are not capable or competent, but these positions of authority also demand a certain level of cruelty. One has to be able to go to war and battle. One has to be able to switch off their kindness and their predisposition towards empathy to be able to enact and exact what a king demands. And the Torah doesn't want women who have a more maternal instinct to suppress that or quiet that in order for what it takes. How does that apply? Rabbi Soloveitchik applied Melech v'lo Malka, the Sifri halacha l'maisa. Rabbi Soloveitchik felt that a woman should not be a president of a shul. Others disagree and say Melech v'lo Malka is a medrash, but it doesn't apply in halacha and are more liberal. It's ironic that Rabbi Soloveitchik, who's thought as the posek and the gadol of the more modern, so to say, community, took that hardline position on female presidents of shuls. Others take more lenient positions, but there is a whole discussion of Melech v'lo Malka, positions of what's called surara. The Rambam calls surara authority, again, not because there's incompetence or lack of trust, but because what are we trying to cultivate, which behaviors or what instinctive gender attitudes do we want to preserve as opposed to want to suppress. The Belzer Rebbe has a beautiful insight, because the Torah tells us about this king. There are several laws that govern the king. Number one, lo yarbe lo susim, you can't have too many horses. Because the king is going to want to increase his stables, want to increase his collection of horses, will be drawn back to Egypt, which is where horse breeding took place. But we're not allowed to go back to Egypt. We're not supposed to go back there geographically, physically, and we're not supposed to go back there in our mentality with superstition and so on. We graduated, we move on, we freed ourselves. The king can't have too many wives. The kesef is all of the and should not pursue too many riches. When the king is on his throne, the kesef lo is mishnah Torah zos al sefer milifnei hakohanim. The halacha is that the king has to write a sefer Torah. The king has to have his own personal sefer Torah. It is one of the halachas. He has to write. Kesef lo is mishnah Torah zos al sefer milifnei hakohanim halavim. V'haisa imov v'karlo kol yomav. And the king will have this Torah with him, and he'll read from it all of his days, so that he will learn to have awe of Hashem and to observe all of Hashem's Torah and his laws, so that he does not become too haughty or arrogant over his brothers. You know, if you're in a position of being a king, you have a palace and a throne, you can off with someone's head, you can call for a capital punishment, your ego can get somewhat stoked, you can get inflated, you can get arrogant. What is the antidote? What does the Torah prescribe to be able to offset the inclination towards arrogance that a king would follow? It is to have a Sefer Torah. To have a Sefer Torah, learning Torah, living Torah, carrying a Torah. Sefer Torah is what will fight and offset that inclination. The Belzer Rebbe, the Sar Shalom of Belz, says, Mikerev achecha. How is it? He interprets this pasuk, Al yidei hiskarvas la'achecha, by drawing close to your brothers, your sisters, by being someone of the people, Avas Yisrael, Achva v'reis ben Adam l'chaveiro, by being a person who loves other Jews, who's kind and compassionate and good and accepting, Yigram adavar shetasim alecha melech, tizke l'kabla atzmacha ol malchu shel olam, melech ma'achei hamlachem HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So how is it that tasim alecha melech? By being mikarev achecha, That's how you should, som tasim alecha melech, mikarev achecha. You can place Hashem as your melech. How? By getting along with Hashem's other children. You can't claim to love God and mistreat his other children. They go together. Rashi says, what's the purpose of the Torah? Why is he carrying the Torah? So Rashi says, not one Torah, but two Torahs. Shtei Sifrei Torahs. One Torah stays home with him, and one Torah comes with him at all times. It is the king's spiritual compass. It reminds the king of his bearings, his context, to whom he reports his sacred mission. The king carries two Torahs, one that is at home, and the second Torah that he carries with him off on the road. We're on Perek Yud Zayin, Pasuk Yud Ches. The Ramban here, those who are following inside, have them across Gedolos. The Ramban here describes, why does he have this Torah? The Torah nizkeres karabo b'sefer nizkar, v'derech ha'emes v'haisa imo Torah atzma tia imo k'derech Hashem v'yashov shlomo kisei Hashem l'melech. The Ramban says the king has to internalize these lessons of Torah to the extent that they remain with him all the days of his life. Learn the Torah. The Torah is the guide. The Torah is the moral compass. The Torah is that anchor. Because the king, as they engage in diplomacy or warfare, the king, as they encounter the opulence of royalty, the king can easily sway or be swayed, and therefore the Torah is their compass, the Torah is the anchor, and that's why he has to have a Torah. The Chassam Sofer writes, Chassam Sofer al Torah, Parsha Shoftim writes, the Torah has to be in the possession of the kings all the time because the king has to make difficult decisions. A king has to decide with whom to engage in diplomacy, with whom to make peace, what to give up for that peace, what level of taxes to levy on the land, how to react to a pandemic. A king has to make nearly impossible decisions all the time. And so the king carries that Torah to remember that the king should not make those decisions arbitrarily or randomly or his own intuition. It is the authority of the Torah that should determine the king's conclusions. That we have a guide. The Torah is supposed to tell us how to behave and how to think. The Torah should guide exactly the conclusions that we come to. The Torah, now he didn't just have one Torah, he had two Torahs. The Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Chaval tells us that there were two Torahs, even though the pasuk just says Vaisimo b'kara kol yamav, that there's one Torah, Mishnah Torah, that's written for him. The Gemara in Sanhedrin learns there are two Torahs, one back in the palace and one he carries with him all the time and wherever he goes. The Rambam writes that there is a different law with these two Torahs. One of the Torahs can be inherited, one of the Torahs he can receive in Yerusha. Let's say the monarchy is being passed on in succession within the family, so one Torah he can inherit. The second Torah he has to specifically write or commission originally on his behalf. What does that mean, these two Torahs? One can be an inheritance and one he has to write on his behalf. So my son-in-law recently had his Ufraf, said a beautiful insight from the Medrash Talpiot, who said the following. He says that the idea is that there's one attitude we have towards Torah. There's one lifestyle of Torah that we have that we got as an inheritance. There's a part of our Torah way of living, a part of our Torah life, which we got from those who came before. Our minhagim, our attitudes, our appreciation, our love, our passion from our parents, and from our grandparents, from our ancestors, from our community. But the other form of Torah is the Torah that we have to write ourselves. We can't just rely on. We can't lean on. We shouldn't be satisfied or complacent with the Torah that we received. We have to write our own Torah. We have to author our own destiny. We have to create our own path towards a relationship with Hashem. It has to be both of these, the two Torahs, the one that we receive in inheritance, Yerusha, and the other Torah that we write. Okay. The Imre Chaim also has an insight into this obligation of writing a Torah. The Imre Chaim says the following. The Imre Chaim, I was going to quote one. Because of those Mishnah Torah Zos, Perish Rashi Shteish Sifrei Torahs, Achash Munachas Beis Nazav, Achash Nechnes V'Yotzis Imo. Remez L'Kol Yisrael. This is an allusion and a hint to all of us. I understand, but I'm not a king. So why does this law apply to me? Kol Yisrael B'nei Malachim Him. We saw in last week's Parsha, Banim Atem L'Hashem Elokecha. We are children of Hashem. And as children of Hashem, if you are a child of a king, then you are a prince or a princess. Then you are royalty. So therefore these laws apply to all of us. She'isnai gal pi haTorah hein bebeisa bebeis gnazav, hanu gam b'chadri chadarim, v'hin k'shiyotze achutz l'masa umatan. Teatorah nechneses v'yotzes imo she'in masa umatno be'emuna. Says the Vision of the Rebbe, says the Heilige Imre Chaim. What the Torah is telling us is that we as malachim, we as kings, we as royalty also have to have two Torahs. The Torah that's at home and the Torah that's on the way. That means to say that we shouldn't think that the moment I leave my house and I go to work, I go to the gym, I go to the supermarket, I go on vacation, I go on a trip, I don't have the Torah anymore. I have a more lenient Torah. I have a more lax Torah. I have a more permissive Torah. No, it's the same Torah. There's the Torah of my home that guides my behavior, my attitude, my relationships, my conversations in my home. And there's the Torah I have to take with me on the way. There's the Torah that tells me be honest and truthful, have integrity at work, be kind and courteous, be compassionate, empathetic. There's the Torah of home and the Torah at work. It's the same Sefer Torah. It's the same Sefer Torah. There's no difference in the Torah. The same rules that guide and regulate who I am and how I behave. It's the same Torah. But there's the one at home and the message that it has to also come with me on the way. It has to guide and inspire my path even as I go. We continue. After the laws of the king, the priestly gifts that we support the Kohanim and Leviim, they serve the people. They are the community kollel. They are the Rabbanim. They are the Klei Kodesh, and therefore they didn't get their own land. They are supported by the people who are grateful for the model they set and the teaching that they offer. So we have the priestly gifts that are given to the Kohanim and the Leviim. Moving right along, prophecy, Hashem sends for his prophets, and here in this context, the Torah tells us, Perek Yirches, Pasuk Yud Gimel. Perek Yirches, Pasuk Yud Gimel. Tamim tiyeh im Hashem Elokecha. Uwa, tamim tiyeh im Hashem Elokecha. Rashi says, Hisalach imo betmimus, v'titzapa lo, v'lo tachkor achar hasidos. Ela kol ma sheyava alecha, kabel betmimus. V'az tiyeh imo ulechelko. Wow, what a mission, what a motto, what a bumper sticker. Tamim tiyeh im Hashem Elokecha. This is it. Hey, look at friends, this is exactly what the Torah is telling us it's all about. Tamim tiyeh im Hashem Elokecha. A person needs to be tamim. Tamim means don't look at horoscopes. And don't look at others, don't worship other sources. And don't be impressed by power or celebrity or fame. Tamim tiyeh, be tamim. Have an exclusive relationship, a monogamous relationship, a reliant and dependent relationship. With whom? On Hashem Elokecha. Be tamim, only im Hashem Elokecha. That's how we are to live our lives. Tamim im Hashem Elokecha. Be tamim with him. Be tamim with him. The tzaddik Rav Pinchas of Koretz says the following. Im Hashem Elokecha. Tamim im Hashem Elokecha. We have im Hashem Elokecha. This notion that we have to be tamim, you should not pursue horoscopes and don't look at other things that predict your future and don't believe in superstition, silly superstition. Only believe in Hashem Elokecha. By the way, there's machlokes Ramban and Rambam whether those other silly superstitions are silly at all. Maybe astronomy, astrology, superstitions, maybe there's truth to it. Maybe we can in fact see our fate and our future by studying the cosmos. The Ramban says there is truth in it, but we're not supposed to look. We're not supposed to rely. Ein Mazel Yisrael, we rely on Hashem. The Rambam says the whole thing is narishkeit and silliness to begin with. But the tzaddik Rav Pinchas Zakaris points out that there's two psukim in the Torah, two mitzvahs in the Torah that have the word im Hashem Elokecha, one in Torah, one in Nach. Ours, tamim tiyeh im Hashem Elokecha, be pure, be complete, be holy, be focused, be exclusive, be singular with Hashem. And the second is hatznei aleches im Elokecha. Hatznei aleches, be modest, be humble with Hashem. With these two midos, hatmimas v'atznias, yochol adam laharim al brios lasos atzmo ketamim o ketzanua, v'ish lo yakir bo ki eino kazeh klal, mishum kach nemar im Hashem Elokecha. A person can walk around and they can act like they're a tamim or they're tzanua. A person can, in public, or for their own notoriety, for their own honor, a person can act like they're such a righteous, holy roller in these two ways. Says the tzaddik Rav Pinchas Zakaris, no, im Hashem Elokecha. Hashem really knows. B'chadri chadarim, when no one's looking, when no one's watching, im Hashem Elokecha. The real measure of whether you're a tamim or whether you're a tzanua is not vis-a-vis your relationship with others, but the real measure of whether you're a tamim or a tzanua is im Hashem Elokecha. It's how you behave. It's how you behave when you are with Hashem. Im Hashem Elokecha. With Hashem Elokecha. I forgot where I saw it. That tamim, im Hashem Elokecha. If you want to be with God, then you have to be a tamimistic person. Like Yaakov Avinu, Ish Tam Yoshev Oalim. You have to be a tamim. If you're a person who does shtick, if you do shtick on your income taxes, shtick in your interaction with others, shtick in your following of the rules, if you're not tamim, if you're not a pure and a holy and an innocent person, if you have other calculations and compromises that you're making, corruptions, then you're not im Hashem Elokecha. If you want to be im Hashem Elokecha, then the prerequisite is tamim. You have to be a tamim if you want to qualify to be im Hashem Elokecha. Torah continues and it goes on and it tells us yet again, the laws of the Ir Miklat. When you're going to enter the land and you're going to eliminate the idolatrous nations, you're going to have to set aside shalosh harim tavdilacha. Set aside three cities for yourselves. Arei miklat. We know that an accidental murder can be pursued by the surviving relatives of the one who was killed, and you run to the Ir Miklat, that city of refuge. We talked about previously, the 6 cities of refuge are the words Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokecha Hashem Echad. 6 words of Shema. Where do we find refuge? Where do we find protection when we feel we are being pursued? We find it by immersing ourselves in the trust under the protection of Hashem. I want to share with you an interesting halacha when it comes to Ir Miklat. A very interesting halacha. The pasuk says, "V'nas alachasa arim v'chai." You run to one of these cities and you live. Pasuk Dalad, Perak Yates, Pasuk Dalad, page 1034 in the Art Scroll Stone Chumash. You run to one of these cities and you will live there. Now the simple understanding is you will live there. What does it mean that you're going to live there if you run to one of those cities? The simple understanding of you will live there is that you will be protected. Remember Tag, when you were a kid, if you're at home, you're touching the home base, then you're okay. Your miklat's the home base, you're being protected. But the Rambam interprets it differently. The Rambam writes, Talmud shegala la'ari miklat, megalan rabo imo. If a student of Torah is fleeing to an Ir Miklat, then his Rebbe goes with him. Shenemar v'chai, because the pasuk says that what is the goal of the Ir Miklat? To live. Aselo kedei sheyichya. So we have to provide for the person who's going to be in the Ir Miklat everything they need to live. If you're a real Jew, if you're alive, if you're a mavakesh, if you're really one who searches and wants to learn, so to be secluded, isolated, to be in an Ir Miklat with no access to Torah, you might as well be dead. So the Torah says the whole reason that we provide the Ir Miklat is to provide you with life, to provide you with protection. So to not have Torah is to be dead even while you're alive. So if a student has to go to an Ir Miklat, the Rebbe goes. And if the Rebbe goes, the whole yeshiva goes with him as well. Why? Because v'chai. Because the whole reason is v'chai, so that they have life. What you see from here is Kihim Chayinu v'Orch Yameinu. The Torah is the oxygen that we breathe. The Rambam gets this from the Gemara in Makos, Daf Yud. If I would have asked you, you're going to have to go into isolation. You have to go into quarantine. You're going to have to be isolated. You're going to have to shut down. What do you need to take with you? Let's say you have no internet connection. What do you need with you? What would you take? What would you take? Your favorite food? Favorite book? Videos? Water? What would you take? V'chai. What would sustain you? So that's what the Torah is saying is, how could a Jew not say, I would need to take Torah? Some sefer. I would need to have it. I would need a Rebbe. Because v'chai. The Torah promises that you're supposed to v'chai, and one of the ways that we live is Torah. We are nothing and we can have nothing without it. And as we begin the month of Elul this week, we should remember that. Torah is fundamental, foundational to the core. We mentioned yesterday at Mincha at Shul, the first Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, that the world exists on 3 pillars, Torah, Avoda, and Gemilas Chasadim. Torah, Avoda, Gemilas Chasadim. And the Menachem Tzion points out, it is specifically in that order, Torah, Avoda, and Gemilas Chasadim. The Torah should inform the Avoda, and the Avoda inspires the Gemilas Chasadim. And it has to be in that order. When Yaakov sent his sons down to Yosef, to Egypt, they went to Goshen. First, they set up a base medrash. First, we need Torah. It's the air, the oxygen we breathe. It's the nourishment we have. Without it, we'll wilt away. Without it, we'll shrivel up and die. We cannot exist without the study of Torah, the inspiration of Torah, without Torah. And that's how he interprets the Menachem Tzion. The Gemara says, why did Kadosh Baruch Hu destroy the Batei Mikdash? Sha'azvim as Torasi, the Navi Yirmiyahu says. What does that mean? We abandoned his Torah. Shelo birchu b'Torah tchila. We did make the bracha on Torah first. They didn't recite the Birchas HaTorah before learning. That's a capital crime that deserves a capital punishment. He says it means Shelo Birchu b'Torah Tchila means when we gave a bracha to our children. We gave a bracha to our children. We blessed them to get into an Ivy League college. We blessed them to break the 6-minute mile. We blessed them to be millionaire, billionaire, trillionaires. What do we bless them for? Shelo Birchu b'Torah Tchila. The first bracha has to be you should be a Ben Torah or Bas Torah. The first bracha has to be that you live a Torah way of life. First bracha has to be that you excel in Torah. And then everything else comes after. So Shelo Birchu b'Torah tchila. They did it out of order. Torah, Avodah, Gemilas Chasadim. Torah has to be the very first bracha we give, our very first hope, aspiration, ambition in our lives. V'chai. If a person has to flee to an Ir Miklat, we have to provide them with Torah because you simply cannot live, you cannot be alive without the holy, without the Heilige Torah. Torah then talks about going out to war. And the Kohen Meshuach Muhammad gives a speech and a motivational talk to inspire the people. Who's eligible to go to war? Who do we keep home? Who do we keep home from war? So Torah says that if you built a new home, if you planted a vineyard, if you got married, and you didn't enjoy the benefit of any of those three new things, then you stay home. Oh, also there's a fourth category. Who is that fourth category? Perachaf Pasuk Ches, page 1040. The officers continue and they say, who is the one who's fearful, faint-hearted? Go home. Don't ruin the what's it called of the army? Not the motivation. Don't ruin the morale. Don't ruin the morale of the army. You're faint-hearted. You're afraid. You're soft-hearted. What does that mean, soft-hearted? So Rashi here explains. What does it mean? Who is this category? The person who built a home but didn't live in it. Rashi says, why do you go home if you built a home and why do we send you back? If you built a home and you didn't yet live in it, why do we send you back? So Rashi says, V'davar shel agmas nefesh huzeh, ish asher yachnechenu, the person who has not inaugurated their new home. We send you back. Why? Because it's agmas nefesh. Agmas nefesh. Let me ask you a question. If you go to war and you die, do you really care that someone else lived in your home before you ever got to live in it? Is that your biggest problem, that you didn't get to take up residence in your new home and enjoy it? Your biggest problem is that you're no longer here on earth. Your biggest problem is that you were killed at war. You're gone. So the agmas nefesh is a person who's more worried about their things than their life. That's agmas nefesh. The person who is more concerned with, more protective of their possessions than they are of their own life, than they value their own life, that should be a cause of agmas nefesh that a person should have. So you built a home but you didn't live in it, or you planted a vineyard but you didn't drink the wine from it, or you're married but you're not yet done with your Shana Aleph, then you go home. We don't want you. But who is this fourth category? Who is this individual who is faint of heart, soft-hearted, who's going to ruin the morale? What did they do wrong, and why are we sending them home? So Rashi tells us, who is this individual? Rabbi Akiva Omer Kimashmo Sheni Yachalama B'Kishrei Machama V'Liros Charav Shlufa. Person who can't see blood. We have a member of our rabbinic staff. I'll protect his identity. If there's a picture or you describe a scene or somebody has a cut, there's blood, he'll pass out, fall flat on his face. There are people who can't see blood. There are people who cannot go to war. They can't imagine pulling a trigger. They don't have what it takes to be able to respond in the moment. So Rabbi Akiva says that's what we're talking about. Soft-hearted means person who's faint of heart, who's soft-hearted. They can't take it. Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer Hayare me'avera shebiyado. Rabbi Yossi Aglili interprets it to mean the person who's afraid of the averos, the mistakes or the indiscretions, biyado, in their hand. They're sent home. What are these averos? Averos shebiyado. The person who has averos in their hand, they're sent home. Who is this person with averos in their hand? So the Ohr HaChaim HaKadosh, we don't have time, or I'd read it with you inside. The Ohr HaChaim HaKadosh says, when a person goes out to war and they're enlisted at the battlefront, it's only natural to be scared. It's natural to be afraid. And to say to yourself, what if I'm unworthy to survive? What if I'm unworthy? What if I don't deserve to come home? The mind will take the soldier to a bad place, and they'll approach the war. They'll go out to battle with fear and with doubt. They'll think about the averos, the mistakes, the poor judgment they've shown, the violations. They're worried it'll all catch up with them. So that's the averos. But why is it described as biyado? The averos biyado, in their hand. Why is it described as biyado? So, where are these averos? Where did they happen? Don't they happen in the fear of the averos happens in your heart, or it happens in your head? Why do we describe, we have to send them home because they'll have doubt and uncertainty, they'll be afraid, and the reason of their fear is because the averos, the mistakes they made. That fear is in the head, or the heart. What do you mean biyado? Rabbi Yosef Bloch, the son of a Rebbe, in his Ginzei Yosef explains creatively, he says the pasuk is telling us the following. When it comes to past mistakes and violations, we know we can always be maharher belev. We can have regret and remorse and commit not to repeat them. We can do tshuva in our heart and repair for the things that we've done. But that which is biyado, the things in our hand, if you've stolen, you can't just decide in your head that you're about tshuva. You have to repair that. You have to return that which you stole. If you damage someone, you can't just decide in your heart that you're a better person. You have to make whole the person that you harmed. That's what the person fears. Averos shebiyado. We send home the person who specifically is afraid of the averos that are where? Biyado. The Imrei, and that's the fourth Ger Rebbe gives a different interpretation. Torah says the person is rach levav, they're soft of heart. Soft of heart, carrying something in their hand. Who is this person? Says the Imrei Emes. Look at the psukim that come right before. We just described the other three individuals we send home from battle. built a new home, planted the vineyard, first year of marriage. When it says we send home the person who's soft-hearted and they're carrying something in their hand, we're not adding a fourth category, says the Imre Emes. We are alluding to the first three. What all three have in common is they're distracted. Their thoughts are elsewhere. How could you be expected to go to battle? How could you be expected to be a warrior and to fight to defeat an enemy when you're thinking about that house and you'll never get a chance to live in it? When you're picturing that vineyard and you'll never have the chance to drink from it? When you have an image of your spouse, of your wife, who you've never had the ability to really settle down with? We don't just send home someone who can't stop thinking about what they did wrong. The stakes are so high and the consequences so grave. We even send home someone who can't stop thinking about something they did right. Nothing wrong with building a home or planting a vineyard, certainly getting married. But those thoughts are extraneous. They're distracting. A person who can't regulate the thoughts, a person who won't be focused, a person who can't quiet the noise in their mind, we cannot afford to risk our future by having them in battle. This is the danger of our time. Pizur hanefesh. Our mind, our thoughts, they're so scattered, they're so fragmented, they're so broken. How can we control our thoughts so we can go to battle? How do we keep our mind from racing so that we can focus on overcoming the Yetzer Hara, what we need to do? Because the Meforshim will describe that the battle in these psukim is the battle against our alter ego. It's the battle against our Yetzer Hara. It's the battle against the voice that is telling us to sabotage. And how does it win? Extraneous thoughts. By contaminating our mind with pollution, with noise. And the way to defeat it is to learn to quiet the mind. The way to defeat it is to remove the aver shebiyado. Biyado, to not have in our hand juggling so many thoughts simultaneously, but the ability to regulate them. Shoftim v'shotrim. We place policemen and officers at the gateway to our brain, to our thoughts. Not every thought that comes knocking do we have to allow in. We're allowed to reject it. We're allowed to tell it to go home. We don't have to let in every thought that occurs to us. There's another interpretation, perhaps. What does it mean? Mizyarish aver shebiyado, Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, that we send home the soldier who's afraid of the averis biyado, the averis that is in his hand, the averis that's in their hand. Maybe what it means is averis shebiyado. Kotzker Rebbe says the issue with the soldier is they don't know how to move on. They don't know how to put down the poor choices, the bad decisions, the indiscretions. The averos, everything they ever did wrong in their life, they carry biyado. And they become debilitated and derailed by this image that they can't do better, that they're unworthy, that they can never accomplish. It's biyado. They can't ever put it down. They carry it with them everywhere they go. They carry it with them everywhere we go. Rav Yitzchak Isaac Sher, the great mashkiach, says, tshuva is not about evaluating the past and getting stuck there. It's not about beating ourselves up or feeling inadequate or incapable or unworthy. Those attitudes, those thoughts, they sabotage our future. And they cause us to forfeit our present. They're not at all what it's about. They elicit hopelessness and helplessness. Tshuva is about being able to move forward. Don't carry the averas biyado. Resolve them. Feel regret for them. Pledge to do better in the future. But don't carry them biyado. Don't carry them around with us all the time. That's what we daven for every night. When we say in Hashkivenu, V'haser Satan milfanenu u'me'acharenu, Hashem, remove the Satan from before me and from behind me. The Satan before me I understand. Satan before me are the temptations that I'll yet confront. I don't want to eat that, say that, look at that, act in that way. I understand the Satan that is before me. Who is the Satan that is behind me? Me'acharenu. The Satan that is behind us is the Avera Shebiyado. When we carry it with us in our hand, when we refuse to put it down or let it go, when we think that we're unworthy and we can't do better, it incapacitates, it debilitates, it prevents us from becoming the people that we're capable of being. Much more to say on our incredible Parsha, but we'll leave it there for this year. Parshas Shoftim. Join us tomorrow morning, 8:15 for 10 minutes of Mesilas Yesharim, 8:45 for Living with Emunah. Tomorrow night, 9 o'clock, we're going back behind the Bima. Have a healthy, a happy, and a holy day.